Alright, so as you guys probably know, there's been a brand new box introduced into Duel Links, and with a brand new box comes a brand new tier list. So it's been about 4 days or so since the release of the latest box, but we've had about 4 days to try out the new cards, see some tournament results, and see which decks seem to be performing pretty well, and which decks are just not really living up to expectations, or what decks have just completely fallen off in relevancy since the release of these brand new cards. Now, do keep in mind, obviously, it's still only fairly early days, meaning over the next coming days, especially leading into the World Championship qualifier, I assume the meta might change a little bit from this. Maybe a couple of decks might drop a tier or move up a tier or something like that. There's still quite a bit of time to discover new techs or new ways to play the new cards, but honestly, I think it's pretty obvious which decks are considered the sort of top 5 or 6 decks in the game, and what everything else is, which is just generally a little bit less powerful than that. I think honestly the hardest part about the current tier list is going to be deciding which of the top 5 or 6 decks are considered tier 2 and which are considered tier 1, as honestly the top 5 or 6 decks right now seem really close in power level, so much so that it's really hard to determine which decks are going to win tournaments, as it just seems like anything could win at any time, considering these top 5 decks just seem really goddamn strong, so should be fun either way. Alright, now just a reminder before we jump into this tier list, if you guys do enjoy this kind of content or have been enjoying some content from me recently, please do remember to leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel. I do make deck list videos for just about every single new deck that's released from every single new box, so if you enjoy these tier lists or my deck list videos or any kind of content from me, please remember to like, remember to subscribe, and let's jump into this tier list. Alright, starting off with, you got your Shiranui. So Shiranui, it's probably just a tier 3 deck. It's sort of been sitting here for a while now. It's definitely a really strong deck, and honestly, if the top 2 tiers weren't so overly strong or powerful like they currently are, it could be considered a top tier deck. Especially, I think actually, yeah, it was actually a top tier deck not too long ago, a top 2 tier deck, but right now, it's not currently keeping up with the top decks, especially with the amount of graveyard hate and stuff that's being thrown into the game. It's just not quite keeping up with the top 2 tiers, but it's still pulling out results here and there, so I think putting it any higher than, any lower than tier 3 will just be a disservice to it, but it's not one of the top 2 tier decks, I don't think. Alright, then we have Amazement. So Amazement, I'm basing purely on the pure variation of Amazement. We're not going off of like Amazement combined with Altergeist or Amazement played with Live Twin. This is just the pure variation of Amazement just by itself, and by itself, it's not too great. I think the main weakness of it by itself is it really relies on the actual trap cards themselves to be really powerful in order for the archetype to work. When it's played with something like Altergeist or with Live Twin, it's way less reliant on that kind of stuff, as it actually has like an archetype behind it to back it up. I think by itself, it just isn't doing all that great. It's definitely much better paired with other archetypes. By itself, it's just too reliant on the trap cards themselves to be strong, which just isn't that great. It needs like an actual archetype to do things to back it up, at least in my opinion. Alright, next we have Prank-Kids. So, yeah, no surprise here. This deck is dog shit, like completely unplayable. It is like, Konami have really done a huge disservice to this deck. I don't know why they didn't at least release, like, Roxy's for the archetype. I can understand not giving us the Link 1, as that might make the deck a little bit too strong, but currently it is just... This is not a functional deck. It is so goddamn bad. It needs like a skill or something. The whole deck is like just 3-card combo reliance in order for it to be playable. And it's just, I've seen so many people in my Discord just trying to make this thing work with various different combos and variations. I even saw in the DLM Discord, Decade of all people was actually playing Prank-Kid or trying to test it out on a simulator to make it work. I don't know why of all decks Decade came back to Duel Links for was Prank-Kid of all things, but yeah, even he was just coping so hard, just deciding it was just really bad. So if Decade thinks this is bad, it's not worth coming back for, then yeah, I'm gonna agree. It is absolutely dog shit. Alright, moving on. TG. This kind of hurts, but it's now a rogue deck. So it was tier 3 until this new box released, and I think that was the final nail in the coffin to actually just boost it out of tier 3. It is just... currently, it struggles really hard into that Ophion PK stuff. Just the Ophion with the negate on the field, it just does not do well into that deck currently. And things like Abyss Dweller are also becoming fairly popular, which is a little bit annoying for it, especially when they're trying to do their follow-up plays with the spell card and graveyard. They can't really, it just doesn't really work too well. So I don't know. There's a lot of things that are just not going too well for it. Also, people are playing a lot of things like DD Crows and stuff. A lot of this anti-graveyard hate stuff, which makes it a little bit harder for TG to run. But it's mostly that Ophion is just super popular right now, and TG is really bad into specifically Ophion, so I'm not super confident in this archetype to be performing really well right now. I think it's just sort of fallen off a bit. It's now a rogue tier deck. Alright, then we have Shaddoll. God, okay, this deck is so close. This is one of those, like, top 5 decks in the game that could be in either of these two tiers at any given day. Depending on what's currently being played and what's going on in the meta, it could be either of these two tiers. I think it's tier 2 right now, though. And my reasoning for that is, currently right now, a lot of people are teching to deal with graveyard sort of heavy decks or things that are trying to use the graveyard. And this Shaddoll is sort of one of those decks. It's not as reliant. It doesn't really summon that much back from the graveyard, I don't think. But it's still one of those decks where if someone summons an Abyss Dweller, you're going to be really disappointed. At least it doesn't die as hard to things like Necro Valleys and Crows and stuff. It does have some issues with Necro Valley because obviously like their trap card likes to banish from the graveyard, that kind of stuff, so yeah, I do think it's a tier 2 deck just because there's a lot of things that are not going well for it in terms of like meta counters, but I could see this being a tier 1 deck. Like if you have an argument for this being tier 1 and you think it's tier 1, put it in there as it honestly could be tier 1, but I think it's tier 2 right now. At least that's what I'd predict it to be. Alright, Fabled. Yeah, this is pretty meh. Unfortunately for Fabled, to be fair, Fabled right now is probably the least explored / sort of discovered of the new decks right now, and not a lot of people have been testing it out, and there's been a lot of different variations possible for it, so it could be a rogue deck, but I don't think it's any higher than rogue at all, and I think it's probably meh right now. It seems to be the case of, if you go first with Fabled, you have a good chance to set up a decent field, but going second, unlike some of these other archetypes, you don't really have good ways to play through fields very easily, and even if you do, like, play through a field, the stuff you're going to be setting up is going to be just not great after expending so many resources to just play through stuff. It just seems like it's a going first deck, it's okay. Going second, you're just not going to do too well. I think it's just sort of meh. Alright, next we have, oh, this one's a fun one, Performage. I think it's tier 3. So this might be a hot take, but I played this deck list yesterday a whole bunch. You might have seen my video on it, and it was really fun, and it seems really good. So the thing that I like about the deck the most is it has that sort of, what's it called, the BLS feel with the Magista stuff of being able to have just outs for things and just play through a lot of stuff. So you just summon your Magistus monster, you can equip it with either a monster negate or a spell and trap card negate to instantly just deal with some annoying thing your opponent set up, whether that be a Winder or an Ophion, or actually doesn't care too much about Ophion, but you get the pitch, like floodgates, or just some might set up a summon breaker or something, but you can just out that thing instantly, or at least force out some sort of disruption to prevent it, and then you can just continue your plays just summoning out a whole bunch of things, activating mind controls, stealing things like your opponent's Winder, just stealing that, shuffle it into the deck, summoning out a Performage. This deck seems much stronger than I think people are sort of giving it credit for, and I think people need to try this out a hell of a lot more, as this deck feels really good. I don't think it's quite good enough to reach the top 2 tiers, because its turn 1 seems to be a little bit lackluster. It seems to be hella reliant right now on the fact that the meta is hella graveyard focused, because it's one of the decks that's incredibly strong at summoning out Dweller. If you want a Dweller, you'll summon it every single time with this deck list, so with the meta being super graveyard reliant, it's turn 1 field of just a Dweller and just like the Magistus Fusion is actually solid enough to play through most games, and going second, the mind controls, all the kind of bullshit this deck can do going second is more than enough for it to be tiered, at least in my opinion. But if the meta swaps and graveyard doesn't become as sort of the focus of the meta anymore, it will probably drop out of tier 3. But right now, when Abyss Dweller is strong, this archetype is going to be strong, at least in my opinion. Alright, next up we have Sky Striker. So I'm putting this in tier 2. So Striker is, again, one of the decks where it could be a tier 1 deck potentially in the future, but I don't think it's quite there, and what Striker does really well right now is it's one of those decks that doesn't care about all the bullshit floodgates going on. Summon Breaker, it doesn't care about. Winder, it doesn't really care about. Ophion, it just doesn't really care about whatsoever. Just all these annoying sort of floodgates, even some of the more just hand traps like DD Crow and Lancia and all that kind of stuff, they can be annoying for the deck, but unlike in some of the other archetypes, they don't just outright kill it or stop you from playing entirely. So with that in mind, it seems like it should be a fairly high tier deck, just because unlike most things in here, it can actually play through most stuff. I think obviously the obvious weaknesses for it are things like its turn 1 aren't super great, and if someone's playing something like an Abyss Dweller, they can probably break through your field and not worry about the reviving back from the graveyard trying to defend itself, and it might just get absolutely blown out. But it does seem to be a deck list worth considering in the top 2 tiers, but I don't think it's quite tier 1. I think of all the top 2 tiers, it's probably the weakest of the top 2 tiers right now, at least in my opinion. Blue Eyes. I think this is tier 1. This has been doing surprisingly well, and I think the biggest sign this might be a tier 1 deck was actually the battle phase the other day. So the thing about this battle phase was it's a side deck format, meaning you can side in any cards for Game 2 and Game 3, which, in my opinion, side deck formats are, I know it's a bit of a tangent, but side deck formats are pretty arse for trying to see what decks are top tier, because if you're just siding in a Lancia in a 20-card game, you're probably going to see that Lancia in 50% of your games to 60%, depending if you're going first or second, and decks like Phantom Knight just suck into Lancia and lose instantly, so I don't like side deck formats too much. But what this showed as being a side deck format, with Blue Eyes just taking like all the top spots in it. So there was what, 3 Blue Eyes players in the top? Only 2. There's 2 Blue Eyes players in the top spots, and I think in the Grand Prix we had 5 that topped. I think what it showed the most though is Blue Eyes can tech in cards a lot easier than other archetypes without caring about the downsides. Like, this guy was playing Necro Valley despite having his fusion spell, which likes to use the graveyard, and he still won the tournament. Like, he doesn't really care too much. I think the other Blue Eyes player also had Necro Valley in the side deck, and I think this guy also had Lancia in the side deck. So I think the main advantage of Blue Eyes right now is, unlike most of the other decks in the top tiers, not only does it not care as much about the floodgates, it can also play the floodgates themselves. So I think this is the best deck right now to include tech cards that really, really harm things like the graveyard without harming themselves. So I think that's why it's tier 1. I think it's the best deck to tech in stuff to beat the current meta. So I think right now, whilst people are still deciding what the best techs are and what the best sort of meta will be, Blue Eyes has the best advantage of just taking advantage of that and taking all the tech cards that seem really strong and being able to include them in their deck list to potentially win tournaments. So I think that's why I'm putting Blue Eyes in tier 1. But like I said before, the top 5 decks are super close, so if you want to put this in tier 2 and you've got an argument for it to be tier 2, that's probably fine as well. But I think right now, it just is the best deck for grabbing tech cards and floodgates and stuff and just playing through stuff as well. Because like, this deck doesn't care about Winder as much as well. Alright, moving on. Mayakashi, yeah. That's unfortunate. So, Mayakashi, I honestly think it is powerful enough to be at least a rogue deck, but unfortunately, with people playing all that annoying anti-graveyard stuff, it is just not doing too well right now. Yeah, this is one of those decks that just, as just a bit of like a, whatever the word is, just a bit of, because of the rest of the meta, it's sort of taking the blow. I can't forget what the word is for that, but yeah, it's taking the blow for the rest of the meta, just doing all this graveyard annoying shit, meaning it's probably not playable right now. Maybe if the graveyard sort of hate lessens a little bit, it might become a top tier deck again, but currently it's just chilling in rogue. Raid Raptor. Okay, this one's I don't think it's top tier. It's one of these 2 tiers. It's not in the top 2 tiers. Nowhere near. But one of the, it could be a tier 3 deck, and I could see it sort of sliding into a couple of tournaments, but I think it's rogue. It's really hard to describe why it's rogue. I think it's going second isn't that great. It has the ability to play through things sometimes, but nowhere near as good at other things. And going first, although it has the potential to set up an absolutely absurd endfield, it doesn't do that endfield as often, like that 7 disruption endfield I showcased the other day. More often than not, it's setting up more like 4 to 5 disruptions, with one of those being just the 3 disruptions on one monster. So if your opponent has a way to deal with that, they can probably break your field. And honestly, going second does not feel that great. I can see the argument for it being tier 3, and it could be a tier 3 deck, especially after some more testing with it, but I think for now it's rogue. I don't think it's doing that great. Also, I think it hard loses to Blue Eyes. Like, I don't think this matchup is like a thing at all, so I think with it, that especially being the case, is another reason why it's probably not doing that great. Also, I think that turn 1 field probably gets broken by Striker as well. But yeah, it also doesn't do very well until the floodgates going around and stuff, so I'm probably putting it in rogue tier for now. Alright, Red Eye Zombie. This one is the closest of the tier 2 decks to putting it in tier 1, but I think right now, specifically because Phantom Knight is popular, Red Eye Zombie is tier 2. It should be tier 1, but as long as Phantom Knight is popular, I think it'll be tier 2, because the amount of Lanciers being played in response to this, and Necro Valleys and stuff, is a hell of a lot more than before. So I think, with that in mind, I think with all the tech cards being used, it's probably tier 2, because this deck hates when you're playing Lancier, and it hates when you're playing things like Necro Valley and stuff, so I think right now, it should be tier 1, but until Phantom Knight sort of calms down a bit, and people calm down a bit on the hype of Phantom Knight, it's probably tier 2. Maybe in the World Championship qualifier, it'll start popping up again, like in the last KC Cup. I believe this deck did super well in that. But right now, with all the Lancier hate, I'm putting it in tier 2. Alright, then we have your Altergeist. This is just rogue. Yeah, so same reasoning as when I did my last tier list like ages ago for trap card specific decks. Back row decks don't seem to be doing super well right now, and Altergeist is obviously just a heavy back row deck. It's probably because Blue Eyes just doesn't care as much about back row, same with things like Striker, there's a lot of dodging going on. Yeah, I just don't think it does that great right now. Also, I think the buffs for the deck, or like the new tech cards, or the new additions to the archetype, not tech cards, but the new like support it got, I think those cards, they did make the deck better, but only in sort of like a technical sense, because they still sort of do the same thing turn 1, they still sort of do the same thing turn 2, with a slight upgrade to it. It's not like there were some absolutely massive advancements that made the archetype absolutely insane. There were like the inclusion of a Link 4 that makes it easier to kill your opponent, and a Link 1 that makes it a little bit easier to Link climb. But other than that, nothing super major for the archetype that should be just like rocketing it in meta ranks. God, I'm stuttering all over the place today. But yeah, it's like I think it's a rogue deck. I don't think it's super great. Alright, Phantom Knight, the one you've all been waiting for. It's tier 2, I think. Phantom Knight has the power level of a tier 1 deck, but very similar to how, I think with Red Eye Zombie, the amount of tech cards being used to deal with this is insane. It is ridiculous. Like it showed in the Battle Phase tournament, I don't think any of them managed to reach the top 4 at least. Yeah, none managed to make top 4. Some might have managed to make top cut, but I think it really shows that when people are hard teching against this with things like your Lanciers and your, oh my god, Heat Waves, you got your Necro Valleys, all these like really even like this guy was playing a Lancier as well. As long as these cards are heavily teched into the current meta, then this deck will absolutely just be so unplayable, it's ridiculous. But it does show though that in the Grand Prix, there was a lot that entered, there was 18 that entered, and 7 of them topped, which is actually a fairly decent conversion rate, especially for a brand new deck that people are still learning. That's a fairly decent conversion rate, so it does show it has the potential to be a tier 1 deck. So if you wanted to put this in tier 1, just like I've said with a billion other archetypes in this video, it could be a tier 1 deck list, honestly. It has the potential to be one. So going into the World Championship qualifier, if this turns out to be tier 1, I would not argue with you. I'd say, sure, that's great. But right now, I think with all the techs, it's probably sitting around here. If techs weren't a thing, these two would probably be the top 2 decks, and Blue Eyes would move down. I think that's what the meta would actually be like. But with all the tech cards, I think it's more like this, I think. Alright, moving on to the final deck, Galaxy Eyes. Yeah, some people have this in tier 3. I don't like it very much. I don't think it's doing too well. I think with the inclusion of another, like, 2 decks to the top tiers, there's no way it's still sitting in tier 3. It was barely hanging on to tier 3, I think. So I personally think has the potential to be tier 3, but in my personal opinion, I don't think it's quite there. I think it's sort of fallen off a bit with the inclusion of so many powerful archetypes. It isn't quite keeping up with the rest of them. Similar to how, like, during the Tachyon meta, there was, like, not even during the Tachyon meta, even slightly after it, it just wasn't quite good enough to be a top tier deck list, but because of all the other stuff, which is slightly better than it. And right now, with everything else being so insanely powerful, I don't think it quite holds on to the tier 3 slot. Yes, I'll put it in tier 3. Alright, and I think that's going to do it for the tier list. So, like I said, I do want to keep my English. I do want to keep reiterating, that's the word, reiterating this point. I do think these top 5 decks, any one of them, maybe excluding Sky Striker, any one of these 4 could be considered a tier 1 deck, depending on how the meta sort of shifts and sort of tech cards are discovered and what seems to be popular. So if you guys have differentiating opinions based on these 4 decks, that's completely understandable. But I think of the best right now, just going off of tech cards and what decks play through things like Lancia and all that bullshit, it's probably Blue Eyes that sort of reigns supreme in my opinion. But any one of these decks could be tier 1. Honestly, if there was like a tier 1.5 or something, you'd probably put these guys in it. I don't think Sky Striker is quite there. Maybe I should do that. Maybe I should make a tier 1.5 and put these 3 in it. Because any one of these could be tier 1, but I think this one's probably the best of them. And Striker's just chilling in tier 2. Yeah, maybe I'll do that. It kind of looks a bit silly, but fuck it. Why not? Let's yeah, I think honestly this is what the actual meta looks like right now. Any one of these decks could be tier 1, but they're not quite there. And Sky Striker is just the solid tier 2 deck that isn't quite competing with these 4. So I like it. I think that's an accurate tier list right there. Alright guys, thank you guys for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you didn't, leave a like, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. And let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Is this tier list completely stupid? Is it just really wrong or badly made or something? Let me know down below. And yeah, thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed. See you in the next one. Laters.